Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Bellevue Christian Church. My name is Sam. If you don't know me, I am a member of the worship team here, and sometimes I'm privileged to be able to lead the worship sets and pick the music and get to kind of lead the service in that way. And so this is one of those weeks. I hope that I don't say anything weird, because as much as I like to sing into a mic, talking is very different. Just wanted to welcome you to our church. If you are new here, you can go to bellevuechristian.church/new and just tell us a little bit about yourself. We're not going to spam you. We just want to know that you were here and, welcome you that way. And if you need prayer for anything, we are a praying church. We love to hear prayer requests that we can be praying for, as well as praises. So go ahead and drop any of those at bellevuechristian.church/prayer. There's lots of ways that we get to worship throughout our lives. We can worship through our work. We can worship with our family. We can worship through singing, and that's what we're going to do today. The Bible says that when we get to heaven, that we'll be worshiping all the time. So we get a little glimpse of that when we worship together on Sunday mornings. So go ahead and stand to your feet as we open our service with some singing, and praise, and worship.
Worship our King. searched the world, but it couldn't fill me. A man's empty praise treasures the faith never enough. You came along, put me back together. Every desire is now satisfied here in your love.
Let's lift it up to him this morning.
Oh, there's nothing better than you. Oh, there's nothing better than you. Lord, there's nothing, nothing is better than you. I'm not afraid to show you my weakness, my failures and flaws. Lord, you see them all, and you still call me friend. 'Cause the God of the mountains is the God of the valley. There's not a place your mercy and grace won't find me again. Oh, there's nothing better than you. There's nothing better than you. Lord, there's nothing, nothing is better than you. Oh, there's nothing better than you. There's nothing better than you. Lord, there's nothing, nothing is better than you. You turn mourning to dancing. You give beauty for ashes. You turn shame into glory. You're the only one who can. You turn mourning to dancing. You give beauty for ashes. You turn shame into glory. You're the only one who can. You turn graves into gardens. You turn bones into armies. You turn seas into highways. You're the only one who can. You're the only one who can.
There's a grace when the heart is under fire. Another way when the walls are closing in. When I look at the space between where I used to be and this reckoning, I know I will never be alone. There was another in the fire, standing next to me. There was another in the waters, holding back the seas. Should I ever need reminding of how I've been set free, there is a cross that bears the burden, where another died for me. There is another in the fire. All my dead left for dead beneath the waters. I'm no longer a slave to my sin anymore. Should I fall in the space between what remains of me and this reckoning? Either way, I won't bow to the things of this world. And I know I will never be alone. There is another in the fire, standing next to me. There is another in the waters, holding back the seas. Should I ever need reminding what power set me free? There is a grave that holds nobody, and now that power lives in me. There is another in the fire. Oh, there is another in the fire. Oh, and I can see the light in the darkness as the darkness bows to Him. I can hear the roar in the heavens as the space between wears thin. I can feel the ground shake beneath us as the prison walls cave in. Nothing stands between us. Nothing stands between us. I can see the light in the darkness as the darkness bows to Him. I can feel the roar in the heavens as the space between wears thin. I can feel the ground shake beneath us as the prison walls cave in. Nothing stands between us. Nothing stands between us. There is no other name but the name that is Jesus. He who was and still is and will be through it all. So come on, May, in the space between all the things unseen and this reckoning. I know I will never be alone. I know I will never be alone. There'll be another in the fire, standing next to me. There'll be another in the waters, holding back the seas. Should I ever need reminding
God, we know that you are with us in all of our storms. You're here with us in the battle. You've been with us forever. You will continue to be with us. You'll be with us forevermore. God, we ask that you would show us, that you would reveal to us yourself when we're in the midst of those crises, that we just feel your presence, that we would know that you're there. God, because we know that you're always with us, we can put our faith and our trust in you. And I pray that you would help us to remember that as we walk with you in our daily lives. In Jesus' name, amen. You can go ahead and have a seat.
Hi, I'm Jennifer McWilliams, and I'll be reading Luke chapter 8, verses 22 through 25. Jesus calms the storm. One day, Jesus said to his disciples, "Let us go over to the other side of the lake." So they got into a boat and set out. As they sailed, he fell asleep. A squall came down on the lake, so that the boat was being swamped, and they were in great danger. The disciples went and woke him, saying, "Master, Master, we're going to drown." He got up and rebuked the wind and the raging waters. The storm subsided, and all was calm. "Where is your faith?" he asked the disciples. In fear and amazement they asked one another, "Who is this? He commands even the winds and the water, and they obey him."
Thank you, Jen, for being our reader this week. I feel like before I start, I have to explain my hands. I was going to try to preach without using my hands, but I use my hands a lot. I threw some renovation yesterday, and I touched something sticky, and then I touched that Pittsburgh black house dust that kind of comes out of everything, and now my hands are disgusting. So learn a lesson. Don't renovate the day before you preach. But if anybody wants to help me with drywall, I'd love to have you. So just let me know. That's just my quick shout out for that. But let's, just because I didn't want you guys to be distracted by some weird disease going on up here, just so you guys know. Okay, we're going to jump in. So I want to start with a quick story. It's early on in the pandemic. It's like March 2020. Spending a lot of time outside in our backyards, things like that. It's a really windy day. I remember it was really windy. And Levi, at this time in his life, he's like 2.5, and he's pretty scared of storms, wind, thunder, all the stuff related to that. And so we were trying to help him overcome his fears. And moms and dads have very different strategies in general for helping children overcome fears. My strategy is stand outside in the wind until you overcome it. Julie's strategy is more of the comfort and that kind of thing, and comfort and prod. Whatever, together we're great. But nonetheless, I don't remember exactly what we told him on this particular day, but I know what the effect was. So I'm sure we gave him some coping strategies. We gave him some reasons not to be afraid. But in the end, the effect had some kind of combination between Gandalf and Jesus calming the storms. And the result was my son standing in the wind with a staff yelling, "You shall not pass." So if you don't believe me, we have a video. I looped it so you can make sure that you catch it. It's pretty short.
You shall not pass. 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 You shall not pass.
You can hear the wind. I can hear his intensity. It obviously didn't work. So no matter how many times he shouted it, it didn't make a difference. But again, that was kind of his default response to storms for a while, was just yelling at them and hoping that they would stop. And I think he's still theologically confused about whether or not "you shall not pass" is like a biblical phrase or Lord of the Rings. He doesn't know the difference yet. But all of us we like my son, we have these default responses to crises. We have these ways that we react when we're faced with something difficult or challenging, not just a regular storm, but something that comes out of nowhere and begins to swamp our lives. And we have different coping mechanisms, different strategies that deal with these inevitable storms. Maybe some of you guys yell, "You shall not pass." I don't know what your strategies are. But no matter what, again, we all have these default strategies. Jesus actually invites us into a different response, a better way of thinking about and responding, not just to literal storms, but to the crises that we face in our lives. And it happens today in one of the most famous passages from the Gospels when Jesus calms a storm. If you have your Bibles, open up to Luke chapter 8, verses 22 through 25. We're in a series right now called This is Jesus, and what we're doing in this series is we're looking at Jesus, his life, his death, his resurrection, in an account that we have about him in our Bibles called the Gospel of Luke. And we've been walking through it little by little. If we were to preach it all the way through, just episode by episode, it'd take like 2 years, so we broke it into seasons in and we're in season 3 right now, Luke chapter 8, verse 22 through 25. And here's how it opens up with a storm. It says, one day he and his disciples got into a boat, and he told them, let's cross over to the other side of the lake. And so they set out, and as they were sailing, he fell asleep. And then a fierce windstorm came down on the lake, and they were being swamped and were in danger. Luke chapter 8, verse 22 through 23. Now, before we jump into the next part of the scene with Jesus and so on, let's just talk about some of the context here to get a sense of what's happening with this storm and why the disciples are out there in the first place. The lake that this is referring to, that they crossing to the other side of this lake, is the Sea of Galilee. If you have been following through in the rest of Luke so far, you know that a lot of Jesus' ministry happens in a region called Galilee, and the lake is named after that region. And the region is on the west side of the lake, and he spends most of his time so far in the first couple of chapters of Luke in and around the same area. But now we find out, we're going to see in the next episode, that he wanted to go to the other side of the lake to a new region to do some ministry where he hasn't done it yet, and it's faster to cross the lake by boat than walk all the way around. And so that's why they get on a boat. He has some experienced fishermen in his group, so it makes sense that they would get on a boat and cross. It's quite likely that there was a fleet of boats, that it wasn't just one boat, but there were probably multiple boats. Mark tells us that in his gospel, that it wasn't just one boat, but that there were multiple boats. And we don't know who was with him on the boat exactly, the names at least. We know that it says one day he and his disciples got into a boat, but it doesn't say he and the 12, which is often what it says when referring to that specific group. It could be the 12, it could be 5 of the disciples, it could be the disciples and some of the women who were also disciples. We really don't know exactly which people were with Jesus on the boat. The boat might have looked like this boat from the first century, from the time of the Gospels. It was actually discovered on the northwest shore of the Sea of Galilee in 1986 during a drought. This boat was just there, and they dated it to the first century, so it's likely that Jesus and his friends would have been on a better version of this boat that wasn't as so deteriorated. But that boat right there is actually 26 feet long, 8 feet wide, so it's like from the front of that piano to this piano over here is about how long of a boat we're dealing with, and it's about 8 feet wide. And so you can imagine being on that kind of boat in the middle of a lake. And we're told that Jesus falls asleep on this boat as well. And I thought about making that the whole point of the sermon, because I think that sometimes we need a good theological case for naps, and this is it. If you've been looking for that, if you wanted one thing from this sermon today, Jesus took a nap, you can take a nap. We're all human. And this is actually one of the reminders, though, that Jesus was 100% human. When we get to the end of the sermon, we're going to talk a little bit about how he's 100% God as well. But it's a reminder that he isn't any less human than we are. He's tired. He gets tired. He needs to take naps. He didn't just live without sleep his entire ministry, but he was tired. He did a lot of stuff, and so he gets on this boat, and it rocks him to sleep, and he takes a nap. And one thing to know about the Sea of Galilee as well, before we continue, is that a decent day can quickly turn into a storm without much warning. In the first century, they didn't have Siri, all the time. I'm like, Siri, what's the weather today? They didn't have hey, what's the Sea of Galilee going to be like today? There's a 75% chance of squall. Okay, maybe we won't go on a boat ride today. But it was just they looked out, they're like, it looks like a nice day. We should cross the Sea of Galilee today. The issue with the Sea of Galilee is the way it's set up. It's topography. It has these hills on the outside, and so the way that can basically create a storm within hours that nobody even saw or anticipated when they got into the boat. And so that's what happens to them. It says there's a fierce windstorm. It's raining so much, the waves are so big that it's beginning to overtake the boat, and it's beginning to sink. And so when we open up this episode, the disciples are in the middle of the Sea of Galilee, and they're in a storm. And unless you're also planning to go on a long boat ride in the middle of a storm, we have to kind of find what is the parallel application for us. Where do we see ourselves? How do we enter into this episode? And the thing that I think that we can enter into is through the lens of crisis. Everybody say crisis. Here's why I think a crisis is a good lens. It's because a crisis feels a lot like a storm, especially the kind of storm that's described here. A crisis feels like a storm. And I think there are at least 3 similarities between this storm and the typical crisis that we might face. Again, a crisis feels like a storm because a crisis feels sudden, first of all. A crisis feels sudden. Like a storm, when you find yourself in a moment of crisis, it often comes on you suddenly and without warning. Again, there's no app that says, hey, 75% chance today of crisis as you go out your door. Just make sure you plan accordingly. We don't get a lot of warning for crisis. There aren't a lot of flags that are saying, hey, there's a crisis on its way. The very nature of crisis usually mean that it's sudden, and it happens without a lot of warning, or at least not a lot of warning signs that you saw. So you might start your day normal, and then you have a phone call, and it changes everything. That's how crisis works. A crisis like a storm also feels consuming. Feels consuming. The word here in this text is a fierce windstorm. It's not just a minor drizzle that's going to go away in a few hours. And we're told that it's swamping or consuming the boat. It's being filled up with water. Like a storm, a crisis feels like it consumes your whole life. You know, all of your thought space, like that boat, is being swamped with these thoughts. You try to think about something else, but the way a crisis works is that it takes over your mental space. You might be trying to have a conversation with somebody, trying to talk to your spouse or trying to talk to a friend or a family member, but in your head, you're thinking about something else. You know, you're 1,000 miles away. Your head space, your mental space is being occupied by this crisis. It's being consumed by the stuff that's going on in your life that this other person doesn't know about. And it's likely that they're experiencing the same thing as well. A crisis also feels threatening. It's sudden, it's consuming, and finally, it's threatening as well. The whole reason a crisis is a crisis is because something is at stake. If there's nothing at stake in a crisis, it's not really a crisis at all. It's just a minor setback or a problem. But the nature of a crisis usually means that there's something at stake. With the disciples, it was their lives. They were on this boat, they had this storm, and their lives were in danger. They were in danger of drowning at sea in this crisis. With us, sometimes if it's a health crisis, your physical life might be at stake. For many of us, it's just something else is at stake, a relationship, your reputation, your sense of stability, your identity, your security, whatever it is. Something is at stake in crisis that's being threatened. And that's what makes it a crisis. So a crisis is sudden, it comes on you without warning, it's consuming, it occupies all of your mental space, and it's threatening. Something's at stake in the midst of crisis, otherwise it wouldn't be a crisis at all. And all of us will face a crisis that's sudden, intense, or threatening at some point in our lives. Some of you have walked in here this morning in the middle of crisis. You are carrying with you thoughts about a crisis that is swamping your mind and that nobody around you even knows about. All of us have been through a crisis at some point in our lives, and all of us will go through a crisis at some point in our lives. Maybe you messed up at work recently and your job feels like it's on the line. Maybe you're nearing the end of the semester at school and it feels like you're failing one of your courses, or you have a major test coming up and you just don't know how you're going to pass. Maybe you're suddenly finding yourself struggling with your emotional or mental health, where you've always been somebody who felt like you had it all together, but now you feel like you're falling apart on the inside and you can't make sense to yourself. Maybe you're going through family drama and everybody's at odds with each other right now, and you feel like you're caught in the middle of it. Maybe you or a family member is seriously ill, and you're just not sure which way it's going to go right now. Might go back toward health, might get worse. Maybe it's suddenly become clear to you that your marriage is on the verge of falling apart. Maybe there were warning signs all along, but you ignored them, and now it feels like you're in a crisis. Sudden, consuming, threatening. Maybe it's financial trouble that you didn't see coming. Maybe it's just a combination of things that on their own are like level 1 crises, but they added up to like a level 5. And all together, it's creating a storm in your life. You don't have to be on a boat in the Sea of Galilee in the middle of a storm to know what it's like to feel what the disciples are feeling. All you have to do is go through a crisis. One that's sudden, threatening, intense, consuming. Again, many of you are in one right now, and the question isn't, will you go through a crisis? Will you experience a storm? The question is, what are you going to do when you're there? Some of you know exactly what you do because you're in one right now. Some of you know what you've done in the past, or you're wondering what you do in the future. The question is, what do you do in the midst of crisis? And I think there's 2 primary responses that kick in the midst of crisis. 2 primary defaults that I see in my own life and in the lives of the people around me in response to a storm. One we can assume the disciples are doing, and one we see clearly. But most of us tend to default toward one or the other, and both of us will experience both at some point during a crisis. And the first default response to crisis is control. Everybody say control. This is the control freaks among us. This is our default, is to jump to control in the moment of crisis. What you try to do in the moment of crisis, you try to manage the crisis. You try to figure out what's going on in the crisis. You break the crisis down into diagrams and charts and graphs and spreadsheets. You figure out how to get a sense of control of what's going on so you can manage it and get it to a place where you get it tamed, where you know what to do with it. When you're trying to control a crisis, when you're one of these people, your first gut response to every crisis is, I can fix this, or there's a solution out there, or I'll be able to, if I read enough or do this or do that, I'll be able to get myself through this crisis. And so some of us default to control. This is me. I'm the control freak here. The way that I know that I do this, you just look back at the beginning of the pandemic. I just started being pastor here, and we were in, and everything was shutting down, and all this kind of stuff. And I remember the first thing I did when the pandemic became real, I didn't make plans. I didn't do anything else. The first thing I did was I ordered a book on Amazon about the 1918 to 20 pandemic. And I said, I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to read this book over the next 4 days. And so I just consumed information. Or I watched every webinar that came, because I was getting lots of webinars that week of like things that you should watch to figure out how to get through this crisis. I watched them all. I read every article I could find. I made summaries of all this information because for me, the way that I saw control was by educating myself. I thought if I can get more information, I can get a better sense of control of the situation that I'm in. And again, because some of us default to control. The disciples, I have a feeling, defaulted to control when they first encountered this storm. We're not told exactly what they did here, but you can imagine with experienced fishermen on the boat, people who have experienced storms on the Sea of Galilee in their life, that they had defaults that went into action in the midst of this storm. They had things that they did that they jumped and tried to take control of the situation. You have Peter and James and John and Andrew, all experienced fishermen. You can imagine them saying, look, all the rest of you guys are useless. Take these buckets and just start bailing water. We're going to tie like alpine butterfly hitches and con splices. I looked up those terms. They're real. Things like that, and we're gonna tie knots. And Zacchaeus, not Zacchaeus, he wasn't on the boat, but Levi, read this book on storms and come back to us with a summary in a minute and help us understand how to get through this. And again, maybe there is this sense that we can get through this crisis if we just get some information, or if we just do what we know, or if we just tie the best knots, or if we just bail enough water, we're going to be able to get ourselves through this crisis. Because again, many of us in situations of crisis default to control. And it manifests itself in different ways. Again, for me, like I said, it manifested itself in getting more information. I thought if I can just get more information about the crisis, I can get through the crisis. Others of us become micromanagers in crisis. We try to assert control of people. We take charge of the situation, whether it's your house or at work. You get very bossy and micromanaging. You become the person who's telling everybody exactly what to do, thinking if I just have more authority, if I just take charge a little bit more, I can control this situation a little bit better. Some of us just are the chicken with a head cut off strategy when it comes to control. We just try everything. We just think, I'm going to try this strategy. I'm going to do this thing that I learned about. I saw NBC talk about this thing on the Today Show. I'm going to try this stuff, and I'm going to control what's going on by steps A, B, C, and D. I'm going to get control of the situation. And others of us, because we have controlling personalities, and when you have a controlling personality that's in a situation beyond its control, what they'll do is they'll find other things that they can control completely not related to the situation. So maybe that in your marriage or in your work, something's out of control, so you do the dishes because you can control those. And you do them violently and intensely because, again, it's something you can control. Or you start controlling the people around you who have nothing to do with the situation and maybe are doing nothing wrong, but you start calling out everything that they're doing because you're trying to take control in a situation. Some of us default to control. Others of us have a different default, though. And we see it in the disciples too. And it's the tendency to catastrophize. Everybody say catastrophize. Some of us have a tendency to control in crisis. Others of us have a tendency to catastrophize in crisis. And what we do in this situation is we imagine the worst possible outcome. As soon as a crisis hits, we say, what is the worst this could go? That's probably what's going to happen to me. Whatever the worst is, that's the thing that's going to happen in my situation. Psychologists actually list catastrophizing and catastrophic thinking as just one of the distortions that we naturally experience as part of our lives. When you're catastrophizing, what you think is not, I can fix this, but it's all over, right? Whatever this is, it's over. My life as I knew it is over. My actual life is over. Whatever is happening, it's over. It's over from the beginning. From the first drop of rain, you're like, it's over. We're dead. It's the end. I've told the story before about how in college, my friends Chris and Cody and I decided to bike 500 miles from Lincoln, Illinois to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania in March, which was spring break technically, but actually winter. We found out when we got to March. And it was like 500 miles, and we had to do like 90 miles a day on old Schwinn bicycles. On all we had was like college energy. We didn't really train a lot, we didn't work out a lot. It was just college youthful energy that we thought we could do this. And so it was me and Chris's idea, and we drug my friend Cody along. We said, come on, you got to come with us. We need a third guy. And so we brought Cody. He's one of my best friends. We were in this tiny town. I remember it was like the second day of this tiny town in Indiana or Illinois. There's like not even a stoplight in that town, but there was a wall, and it had a spigot. And so we filled up our water bottles, and we sat on the wall for a little bit, and we took a break. It was like 35 degrees, but we sat on that wall and enjoyed our break, our water, and our granola bars. And when we finished, me and Chris got back up, and we're like, all right, let's get back on the bikes. We have 80 miles to go or something. And so we were getting up back onto our bikes, and we were getting onto them, and we noticed that it was just me and him, and Cody wasn't with us. He was still back on the wall, sitting on the wall, thinking about the wall, thinking about our bikes. And I said, hey, Cody, come on. And he said, I'm not getting back on that bike. And he was very stern about it, which was different for Cody, because he had not ever been that kind of stern and resolute about a thing in my experience with him. And he's like, no, I'm not getting back on the bike. I'm like, come on, dude, get back on the bike. And then he starts kind of like mumbling to himself. He's like, we're never going to get back. Never going to get back to my girlfriend. We're just going to be out here forever. I knew he was being a little bit ridiculous, but I was over it. And I said, Cody, come on. And then he looked at me and he said, stop being a jerk. But in that moment, he was catastrophizing, and I was over it, and so was he, and he was over me. I was asserting control. He was catastrophizing, and together we were a terrible friendship, and my friend Chris was caught in the middle, and for the rest of the day, me and Cody did not talk to each other, and Chris had to ride awkwardly in the middle of us. We're still friends today, so it all worked out. But some of us have a tendency to control. Some of us have a tendency to catastrophize. And again, we see the disciples catastrophizing here. You can imagine, again, they tried to control, but when they realized that the boat was going under, that none of their bailing water was working, then they switched to catastrophic mode. And they said, forget it. Wake up Jesus. So they woke up Jesus, and what do they say to him? They say, hey, you might, there's a storm. We just want to let you know that me and the guys are talking, and we really think you should be a part of this, or you should be aware. We just want to make you aware of the storm. No, they wake up Jesus by yelling this, Master, Master, we're going to die. I don't know if you've ever been woken up like that in your life before, but that's how Jesus gets woken up in this moment of all of their catastrophic thinking, which maybe was happening on the inside, is now happening on the outside, and it's the first thing Jesus is hearing on waking up from his nap, Master, Master, we're going to die. At this point, they have decided, these experienced fishermen, it's all over. We did our best, we tried to control, now we're catastrophizing, it's over, we're going to die. And I know that some of you have had this experience before, where you started off trying to control, and then you went to catastrophic thinking, or maybe you just skipped the whole control portion, and you went straight to catastrophizing. Some of you might be facing a crisis, maybe a health crisis, or maybe just something weird about your health, and you were up late on WebMD at 2 a.m., and you're like, that's it, I'm going to die. Whatever this is, it's going to kill me for sure. Some of you might be facing another kind of crisis, maybe one that's not related to your physical life, and you find yourself feeling again that life as you know it is going to be over, that's it. My life is over. My marriage is over. I'm going to get fired. My friends are going to find new friends. I'm going to be bankrupt. I'm going to fail college. I'm not going to amount to anything ever. I'm going to be lonely forever. Some of us have had these thoughts where we just catastrophize a crisis in our lives. Your physical life might be fine, but your day-to-day life feels like it's over. The disciples probably started again by trying to control the situation, but eventually they found themselves catastrophizing. And when we're facing a crisis, some of us default to control, other of us tend to default to catastrophizing, even if both of us usually go through both phases at some point. What I want to know is which one you default toward, and please don't answer for your spouse, because I think all of us have answers for our spouses. But who here defaults to control? I want to know. Who are the control freaks among us? Okay. Who are the catastrophizers? Come on, be honest. Okay, catastrophizers, good to know who you are. Who here has no idea? Okay, great. So some of us default to control, some of us default to catastrophizing. Both of us end up at some point. Regardless of your default, though, what we see here with the question that Jesus asked is that there's a better way. There's a better response to crisis. It says this, the text says, once they started catastrophizing, they realized there was nothing else they could do. They woke up Jesus, and here's what happens. It says he got up, he rebuked the wind and the raging waves, so they ceased, and there was a calm. And he said to them, "Where is your faith?" Everybody say faith. So Jesus gets up. He gets up from this nap. He's woken up again. His alarm clock is one of the disciples yelling, "We're going to die." He looks at the wind and the waves, and it says that he rebukes the storm. And that word's not like an accidental word. It didn't say, notice it didn't say he calmed the storm here. It doesn't say he said something to the storm. It doesn't say he spoke some words. The word it uses is rebuked. That's meant to trigger something for us. If you've gone through the Gospel of Luke so far, when else has that word rebuked showed up? It showed up when Jesus had to rebuke the fever that was affecting Simon's mother-in-law. Jesus rebukes diseases. There's another point where the demons have consumed a person, and what does he do? He rebukes those demons. He doesn't just say, "Get out of her," or anything. There's the word that's being described, what he's doing is rebuke. Because rebuke is what somebody with authority does. Just as a parent might rebuke their children, Jesus is rebuking diseases. He's rebuking demons. How he's rebuking a storm. He's showing that his authority extends to every aspect of the natural realm. And so when he speaks, something happens. And again, when my son spoke, nothing really happened. There was no result. The wind kept coming. But when Jesus speaks to a storm, it immediately ceases, and it's followed by a calm. And after he calms the storm, the question he asks is, "Where is your faith? Where is your faith?" As I was reading this week, that was the phrase that kept coming back to me. Where is your faith? Where is your faith? As I was reading that, I just kept thinking, didn't it take faith to wake you up? Didn't the disciples show faith by going to you in the first place? Didn't the disciples show faith when they went to you when there was nothing else they could do and they thought, "You're the one who can do something about this"? Was he just grumpy? I'd be grumpy in that situation. Was he just grumpy and just saying, "Okay, we're just going to skip to the main point of my next sermon. Where's your faith?" What's going on? Because this felt like faith to me. It feels like faith in a moment of crisis to go to Jesus and to say, "Wake up, do something, help us out, we're going to die." It feels like faith. But according to Jesus, when he looks at what they're doing, he says this isn't faith at all. You're still missing it. In fact, for Jesus, one of the things that I think he helps us see is that our tendencies to control and our tendencies to catastrophize will often masquerade as faith. That often what looks like faith to us is actually just a spiritualized version of our tendencies to control or our tendencies to catastrophize. Sometimes, for some of us, we go to Jesus just as a spiritual way to get control of a situation. Some of us go to Jesus because we're control freaks. And so we go to Jesus because for us, Jesus is not just the one in control of the situation. That's still us. But we go to Jesus because we've run out of other options. We've tried using every strategy. And Jesus is just one more strategy that we can make use of in this situation. And so it's just spiritualized control masquerading itself as faith. We're taking this tendency to control and we're applying it to our relationship with Jesus, and we're reducing Jesus down to a tool we can use in crisis that we can discard of during our next one when we don't need him. And so we have this tendency to use Jesus as just another means of control, where in that situation it's still ourselves that we're looking at. Others of us, though, our relationship with Jesus is just a spiritual version of catastrophizing in a moment of crisis. Some of us go to Jesus. In fact, in the book of Mark makes this even more clear. When they go to Jesus, they say to Jesus, "Why don't you care that we're going to drown?" Everybody say care. They say, "Why don't you care that we're going to drown?" What they're doing now is they're not just looking at the crisis around them and thinking we're going to die. They're looking at Jesus and they're deciding that Jesus doesn't even care about them. You don't even care about me as well. And so not only are we catastrophizing whatever situation we're in, we're now having spiritual problems as well. We're now looking at Jesus and saying, "Jesus, you don't even care about me. Where are you? Are you awake right now? Do you know what's going on in my life? Have you seen what I'm going through right now?" And so what ends up happening is we take our tendency to catastrophize and we apply it to Jesus, and it looks like faith because we're waking him up and we're going to him and we're praying to him, but really the attitude that we're bringing to it is just another way of expressing that same tendency. Seeing our relationship with God as broken too. And so in facing a crisis like the one the disciples are facing, we tend to default to one of these two things. And sometimes what looks like faith to us is actually just control or catastrophizing, but Jesus here invites us to something else. This question is not just a condemnation, it's an invitation. And what Jesus is doing here is in the midst of crisis, Jesus is inviting you to something better than control or catastrophizing. Jesus is inviting you to have confidence in him. In the middle of a crisis, Jesus is inviting you to have confidence in him. He calls this faith in this passage, but faith is a very churchy word sometimes that I think we can miss. But faith is a word that simply means to trust or to put your confidence in someone. When Jesus says, "Where is your faith?" it's just another way of saying, do you trust me? Don't you trust me? Where's your confidence, guys? Is your confidence in me? That's just another way of saying, where is your faith? And so instead of, if control is looking to yourself, and catastrophizing is looking only at the crisis itself, confidence is looking to Christ in the midst of the crisis. One looks at yourself, one looks at the crisis, the other looks to Christ in the midst of crisis. And that's what confidence is all about. And if you're looking through the Gospel of Luke so far, you've probably started to pick up on a theme that Jesus is often pointing out when people don't have faith and when they do. Notice in Luke chapter 5, verse 20, an episode that we've already looked at, a few friends brought their friend to Jesus who was paralyzed. And it says this, when Jesus saw their faith, he said, "Friend, your sins are forgiven." Their confidence in him. And in Luke chapter 7, verse 9, when a Roman centurion believed that Jesus could heal his servant with a word, it says, when Jesus heard this, he was amazed at him. And turning to the crowd following him, he said, "I tell you, I have not found such great faith, even in Israel." Luke chapter 7, verse 50, a sinful woman anoints the feet of Jesus. She barges into this party, and he says this to her, "Your faith has saved you. Go in peace." Your confidence in me, your trust in me. In each of these episodes, people are displaying faith, confidence in Jesus in the midst of crisis. And so at the end of this scene, what Jesus says to them is not, "Hey, good job showing faith." He says, "Where is your faith?" He's inviting them now to rethink. He's inviting us as readers to rethink this whole scene now through the lens of confidence. We know what this scene looks like through the lens of trying to control. We know what this scene looks like through the lens of catastrophizing. We know what the crisis in our life looks like through the lens of those two things. But what Jesus is inviting us to do here is now replay this whole episode. Rethink this whole episode. What would it look like for the disciples, instead of moving to control or catastrophizing, what would it look like for them to go to confidence instead? I'm speculating, but let's just imagine it for a minute. As the storm got worse, I have a feeling that the disciples probably still would have applied all of the knowledge that they had to the situation at hand. Or to be stupid, they're fishermen. They know what to do in a situation of a storm. So of course they're going to apply. They're going to bail water. They're going to tie knots and so on. But they would have done so without the anxious thinking that says it's all on us to get out of this crisis. You see, there's two different ways to do something in the midst of crisis. There's the way of, I'm in control of the situation, or there's the way of saying, ultimately, I'm not in control of the situation, but I'll do what I can in the midst of this. Trusting that it's not me, I'm not putting my hope in myself and my strategies. And so if you're confident in Jesus, you'll still do something, but instead of coming from a place of needing to control the situation, it's coming from a place of knowing Jesus is in control, no matter what happens. Your faith is not in your ability to get yourself out of the situation. Your faith is in Jesus, even as you do things. And again, I think they probably would have faced the possibility that they could die. Right? These were fishermen. These are guys who had friends growing up who went out to the Sea of Galilee one day and never came back because they too had experienced storms and their ships had wrecked. They too knew stories. They too knew what happened to people in this situation. They weren't wrong to say there was a real possibility that they could die. What ended up happening though is when that thought consumes you, when that becomes the only thing at this point, that's when the problems begin. If you're confident in Jesus, it doesn't mean you ignore the possibility that your physical life or life as you know it could end when you face a crisis, but it means that you don't let that possibility consume you anymore. That possibility doesn't define you. It doesn't shape your entire existence because you know that Jesus cares for you. And as Romans says, not even death can separate us from the love of God. You could lose everything in your life. Life as you know it could completely change, but that can still not change us at all because we know that Jesus is with us and cares for us in the situation. Be like the disciples saying, it might not seem like Jesus is doing anything right now, but we know that he has us in the end. A lot of people think the answer to catastrophizing is saying, oh, that won't happen. The worst won't happen. But actually, the people who catastrophize are right some of the times. The worst could happen in a lot of situations. But what you're saying is, even if that does happen, I'll be okay in the end because Jesus cares for me. And it leads now to the end of that story. Would they wake up Jesus? That was a question I was thinking if they had been confident in him, would they have woken him up? I don't know. I think they might have, but I think they would have said something different. I think if they had been confident in him, they might have said something like this: Jesus, we know that you care for us. We've been doing everything we know to keep the boat afloat. You know that. We've been bailing water. We've been trying all this stuff. We've seen you cast out demons and heal these diseases. And we're confident, based on what we've seen so far, that even though we've never seen you calm a storm, and it might feel crazy to imagine that you could do this, we believe that you can do something about the situation that we're in. And then at the end saying, but even if that doesn't happen, even if you and us go down with this boat, we're not afraid because we know that you're with us. We know that even if the boat sinks, we will still trust you because you're a God who has authority that extends even over death. Now, obviously, Luke did not have time to, or that would be a lot for this episode to try to include as a possibility. But I like to imagine that's what confidence might look like in this scene. Because in the midst of crisis, what Jesus is inviting us to with this question is he's inviting us to confidence in him. Now I encourage you to replay your last crisis or your current one. What would it have looked like if instead of defaulting to control or catastrophizing, you defaulted to confidence in Jesus? What would it look like if you had faith in the midst of a health crisis? Again, it doesn't mean that you have faith that this will be healed every time. But what does faith look like in the midst of a health crisis? What would faith look like in the midst of your relationship struggles? Again, it doesn't always mean Jesus will fix it or that you do nothing. But what does faith look like in the midst of that? What would faith look like in the midst of emotional disruption? What would faith look like in the midst of unexpected financial setback? What would faith look like in the midst of uncertainty at work? What would faith look like in the midst of all of these things that are piling on one another? Again, in the midst of crisis, Jesus is inviting you to have confidence in him. Instead of control or catastrophizing, Jesus is inviting us to something else. It doesn't mean you sit back and do nothing. It just means that you do things differently. It doesn't mean that you don't accept the possibility that the worst could happen, because it could. But Jesus will be with you even in the midst of that. It doesn't even mean that Jesus will wake up and he will rebuke the storm that you're facing. That would be a lot of people read this and they take away that promise. They're like, here's what this means. It means Jesus will calm every storm or crisis that I'm facing. That's not the promise at all of this text. The only promise Jesus makes here is that he has authority over it and that he's in the boat with you in the midst of it. It doesn't mean your crisis or your storm will end, but it does mean that Jesus is with you in the midst of it no matter what happens. It means that your confidence means you're trusting in Jesus in the middle of the crisis no matter what happens in the end, believing that Jesus is in control when life feels out of control. And so the question is, why didn't the disciples do this? Why do we often not default to this in the first place as well? And the last verse tells us. Last verse here says, here's how the story ends. They were fearful and amazed, asking one another, who then is this? He commands the winds and the waves, and they obey him. So this episode ends with a question, a statement, but a question that we're not really given the answer to, a question about Jesus' identity. One of the main themes in the Gospel of Luke is the question, who is Jesus? Over and over, you hear that question haunting the Gospel. From the beginning to the end, there's this question in the mouths of the Pharisees. This question shows up in the mouths of the disciples. This question shows up in the mouth of a Roman soldier. This question shows up in the mouths of so many people in their hearts as well. As they're seeing Jesus do things, they're asking, who is this? Is he a prophet? Is he a teacher? Is he a mere human? Is he something more? Is he sent by God? Is he a messenger? Is he an angel? Is he a cult leader? Who is this? What is this person? Who are we dealing with? That's the whole reason we called this series, This is Jesus, because that's what Luke is doing to us, is he's inviting us to ask this question throughout the gospel. This question, who is this, shows up again and again, this question of identity. And at this point, they knew some things about Jesus. At this point, they knew that Jesus could forgive sins. They knew that Jesus taught like nobody else they'd ever heard. They knew that Jesus could cast out demons. They knew that Jesus could heal the sick. Soon they would see that Jesus could even raise the dead. But at this point, they still did not know who Jesus was. Despite all the stuff that they knew about Jesus, they could not put it together yet, like so many of us, despite everything that we know, can't put it together and can't figure out who Jesus is. What is his identity? They still don't have a category for the kind of person that they are dealing with. And here's why that matters. Until you're clear about his identity, you won't have confidence in his authority. Until you are clear about the identity of Jesus, you will not have confidence in the authority of Jesus. So many of us, the reason we default to all these other things in a moment of crisis is because we are still not clear about the identity of Jesus. What crisis does to each of us is crisis is a great revealer. It shows us what's in our hearts. It shows us what we believe. When you go through crisis, you find out there's a gap between what you say you believe and what you actually believe. And in a moment of crisis, you will find out what you think about Jesus. In a moment of crisis, what they are finding out is that they still do not have the identity of Jesus nailed down. Because if they did, they would have had confidence in his authority. Because until you're clear about his identity, you will not have confidence in his authority. They still might have thought he was just someone interesting. They still might have thought that he had some special forgiveness power, some healing, some demon casting out skills. But as a result, they weren't placing their confidence in him yet. They were still seeking control. They were still catastrophizing. They were still looking at themselves or the crisis instead of to Christ. Until you're clear about his identity, you won't have confidence in his authority. Some of you have been in church your whole life and you're still not sure who he is. Some of you are showing up today for the first time and you have no idea what you're walking into. Some of you know stuff about Jesus at this point in your life. You know that he has some good one-liners. You know that he can forgive sins. You know that he can do some interesting stuff, but we still don't know who he is. And so we still default to control or catastrophizing. Because until you're clear about his identity, you won't have confidence in his authority. And so when the disciples ask this question, who then is this? It's not just them asking, it's us joining in. It's them asking us as well to consider, who are we dealing with? It's an opportunity to sit right there in the boat with them in the midst of our crisis and to consider who he is. Because until you understand who he is, you're always going to put your confidence in the right place. At the beginning of this episode, I mentioned that his nap reminded us that Jesus is 100% man. He's a human like us. He gets tired. He's in a physical body. And for some of us, that's functionally how we live. We live as if Jesus was just a man, just an interesting guy, a good teacher who can teach us some stuff, but that's it. But at the end of this episode, his actions confirm that he's more than 100% man. His actions point to the truth that we claim theologically, that he's not just 100% man, but he's 100% God as well, something that becomes increasingly clear throughout the gospel. It's a fact that was hinted at earlier when the Pharisees asked in another episode, who then is this who even forgives sins? And now we're seeing Jesus do something that only God has been known to do, the God who made the waves, the God who made the wind, the God who separated the Red Sea, the God who in Psalm 107 calms the sea, the God who in the book of Jonah stirred up the sea and calmed it right after that. That God is now with them in the boat. In this moment, what they're realizing is that Jesus breaks out of the boundaries of how we've been trying to identify him, and he is showing us that he is so much more, because until you are clear on his identity, until you understand who he is, we will never place confidence in his authority. And if Jesus can deal with the wind and the waves, surely he's in control of whatever crisis we're facing. The same Jesus who is in the Gospels is the same one who is with you now. Many of you have clarity in your heads about who Jesus is, but in the midst of crisis, we go to our defaults. We go to panic mode. We forget who he is in our hearts. That's why I want to leave you with a word from Augustine from centuries ago for us when he preached on this passage. He says this, "You've forgotten his presence. Rouse him then, remember him, let him keep watch with you, pay heed to him. A temptation arises, it is the wind, it disturbs you, it is the surging of the sea. This is the moment to awaken Christ and let him remind you of those words. Who can this be? Even the wind and the sea obey him." It's an invitation to look to him again, to remember who he is, not just with our heads, but with our hearts. As a result, we might be able to be in the crisis just like Jesus was. Why could Jesus sleep in a moment of crisis? Because he knew what was going on. He was in control of the situation. So many of you, when you're in moments of crisis, it keeps you up at night. You can't sleep. But like Jesus, when we come back to confidence in him, you can actually fall asleep at night. You can actually have calm. You don't have to have the waves around you disturb your soul, because you know that Jesus is with you and that he's in control of the situation. And you can lie down there right next to Jesus and go to sleep. Some of you needed that word tonight. That was added in for the second service, so that you can sleep tonight in confidence that Jesus is there, that he loves you. And as Psalm 127, he gives sleep to those that he loves. He cares about you, and he's in control of the situation. When they get his identity right, when we grasp his authority, the result is that, like the disciples, we feel fear and amazement. It's fear because you're in the presence of a great power, and it's amazement because you've never seen anything like what Jesus does here. And in the end, fear and amazement are two words that describe what worship is meant to be like. So as we close, I want to pray, because I know that some of you are in the middle of a storm right now. And I want us to head back into worship after communion with fear and amazement. Why don't you guys bow your heads and close your eyes right now? If you're in a storm right now, I just want you to raise your hand, and I just want to pray specifically for you. If you're in a crisis right now that you just need some help, and you want to receive prayer, just raise your hand. I see those hands. Anyone else? All right, thank you. You can put those down. Let me pray. God, some of us are in crisis right now. We know what it's like. We feel like we're finding ourselves in a place where the waves are big. It's disturbing our soul. We're not sure where you are. We're not sure if you care for us. We're defaulting to control. We're defaulting to catastrophic thinking. But Lord, may we not look to ourselves. May we not look to the crisis, but maybe look to you, Christ. Lord, I pray for those who are in the midst of storm, that they would sense not your condemnation, with the question, where is your faith, but your invitation to place their faith in you, to place their confidence in you today, God. You love us and you care for us, and you're with us in the storms. In your name we pray. Amen.
Now, there are a couple times in the Gospels when the disciples are in crisis while they're in ministry with Jesus. He says something that kind of shakes them to their core. Probably when Jesus said to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan," that may have been a crisis moment. But one that really stands out to me is right before they take the Last Supper, they do the sacrament of communion for the first time. And Jesus, it says in Matthew that he told everyone that one of them was going to betray him. And they were all in shock and wondering, is it me? Am I the one that's going to betray him? And that was probably a moment of crisis. But Jesus responds to that news, to giving that news. He responds in confidence because he knows exactly who he is. He knows that he is God. He knows that that is part of the plan, part of the rescue plan for us. And he knows that his death means the resurrection is coming afterwards. So right after that, they take the meal, they eat the bread, they drink the wine or the juice. And we can do that now with confidence in who Jesus is, because he did it first with that same confidence. So this time in the service, we invite you to take communion. And as you're doing that, remember the confidence that we have in Jesus and the fact that he is always with us and that we can place our faith in him. When you're ready, you can stand with us for this next song. This song is called "It Is Well," and it references that same story, that same storm that we were talking about. And it says, through it all, through all the storms, that our eyes are on him. So use this as a time of reflection, of worship for who Jesus is, and remember the ways that he has been with you. And make this a declaration for your life that when you're in the middle of a crisis, that you'll look to him.
Grander earth has quaked before, moved by the sound of his voice. Seas that are shaken and stirred can be calmed and broken for my regard. Through it all, my eyes are on you. Through it all, it is well. Through it all, my eyes are on you, and it is well with me. Far be it from me to not believe, even when my eyes can't see. And this mountain that's in front of me will be thrown into the midst of the sea. Through it all, my eyes are on you. Through it all, it is well. Through it all, my eyes are on you, and it is well. It is well. So let go, my soul, and trust in Him. The waves and wind still know His name. So let go, my soul, and trust in Him. The waves and wind still know His name. So let go, my soul, and trust in Him. The waves and wind still know His name. So let go, my soul, and trust in Him. The waves and wind still know His name. The waves and wind still know His name. It is well with my soul. It is well with my soul. It is well with my soul. It is well. It is well with my soul. with me.
Church, where ordinary people are learning to live everyday life like Jesus. And so whether you join us in person or online this week, we're glad you're here. If you are joining us for the first time, I'd love to get to know you. We'd love to pray for you this week as well. So take one of those little new person cards that say your life is made for more and give it to me on your way out. And we'll have just a gift for you as well. And we'd love to use that as an opportunity to meet you as well. A couple of things coming up we want to tell you about. First of all, is we have a baby and child dedication coming up. We're a church where ordinary families are learning to live everyday life like Jesus. We know we're a community where people often start families. And so child dedication is an opportunity for you to thank God for the gift of children, make a public commitment to raising your children to follow Jesus, and then most importantly, to invite your church family into the process of raising your kids. It's not anything the Bible says you have to do this. It's not a salvation thing. It's just something we do as a church just to include the rest of the church in this. And so if you're interested in dedicating your children, we ask that you attend our child dedication class tomorrow night from 6 to 7:15. I know that's coming right up to bedtimes, but we will do our best. I'm speaking though, so who knows? We'll do our best to get out by 7:15. We'll have childcare there as well. We've got like 8 families signed up. We've had a lot of babies in the past 2 years. We're a little bit behind on child dedication. Sorry, church. And if you've signed up, you'll get an email tomorrow with some details. But we'll be meeting downstairs here at 6 o'clock. And so the service itself will be Sunday, November 21st. It's not going to be like the full service. It's just a couple of minutes of the service, kind of like we did with membership. You can find out details for that. Register at bellevuechristian.church/events. Additionally, some of you guys have been part of our everyday groups. Those are wrapping up this week for the season. We'll be starting those back up in February. And if you've enjoyed that, tell other people about it who haven't been at one or maybe are nervous to join an everyday group. We'll be starting those back up in February. It's one of the best ways to connect with other people in our church. Additionally, though, in the meantime, as these groups come to a close, we have a stitching meetup that's going to be starting this Thursday. It's going to be going from 6:30 to 8. It's going to go through December 16th. It's going to be at Renee Armstrong's house right here in Bellevue. And once you sign up, she'll send you info about where she lives and stuff like that. And stitching is an opportunity for people, beginners and experts alike, to build community while stitching. It's not just about stitching. It's about making new friendships. And so if that's something you're interested in or just want to make some friends, you can sign up by going to bellevuechristian.church/events. We're going to have some more events coming up as well for men and women in December. We can't wait to tell you about that, but we're just pulling together some final details. Now, if you would stand for the Great Commission. Jesus says this, "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Therefore go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I've commanded you, and I'll be with you always, to the very end of the age." Amen.